The thing about apex predators is that they rarely meet anything that makes them reconsider their place in the food chain. But I was there 3 cycles ago on Station Tarthos-9, a grimy refueling depot on the edge of the Corvath Nebula, when the entire galaxy's understanding of dangerous got a serious recalibration. My name's Vix'tharion, but everyone calls me Vix. I'm a Selkathi trade liaison, which is a fancy way of saying I facilitate deals between species that would rather eat each other than shake appendages. I've got 4 eyes, bioluminescent skin that shifts colors with my mood, and I've seen enough violence in my 40 standard years to know when something's about to go spectacularly wrong. That day started like any other. Badly. The station was packed. Krovan mercenaries drinking fermented algae in one corner, a family of Thelonian refugees trying to barter passage in another, and somewhere near the docking bays, a human crew had just arrived. I didn't think much of it at first. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, only about 60 standard years since first contact, and most species treated them like curious novelties. Soft-skinned bipeds from a backwater world called Earth, known mostly for their bizarre attachment to creating art about their own extinction, and their inexplicable love of caffeinated beverages. The crew consisted of 5 humans: Captain Yuki Tanaka, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue; her second in command, a towering man named Dmitry Volkov, who moved like a mountain, deciding whether to fall on you; their engineer Rosa Delgado, who had grease stains on her hands, and what I'd learned was an unhealthy affection for explosives; a medic called Ayana Okonkwo, whose smile could disarm a nuclear warhead; and their pilot, Jinsu Park, who looked barely old enough to operate a hover scooter, let alone pilot a ship through hyperspace. They were hauling medical supplies to the colony worlds past the Veil. Noble work, honestly. And they'd stopped at Tarthos-9 for repairs and provisions. I watched them from my usual perch near the central marketplace, noting the easy way they moved together, the casual competence that marked experienced crews. Nothing special, I thought, just another group trying to make a living in the endless dark. Then the Krathka arrived. Now, let me explain something about the Krathka. They're not just predators, they're the nightmare that other nightmares have nightmares about. 8 feet tall, covered in chitinous armor that could shrug off plasma fire, with mandibles that could snap a steel beam in half, and a collective intelligence that made them terrifyingly efficient hunters. They'd conquered 17 systems before the Galactic Council finally negotiated a treaty that basically amounted to "please don't eat us. Here's some planets you can have instead." 3 of them stomped into the station's main concourse, and the temperature, both literal and metaphorical, dropped about 20 degrees. The lead Krathka was a beast named Throatrender, which tells you everything about their naming conventions. His carapace bore the scars of 100 battles, and his secondary arms carried weapons that could vaporize most organic matter. The crowd parted like water around them. Krovan mercenaries, beings who fought for fun, suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The Thelonians huddled together, trying to make themselves invisible. Even I dimmed my bioluminescence to a faint glow, hoping to avoid notice. Throatrender scanned the concourse with multifaceted eyes, seeking something. Trouble, probably. The Krathka had been pushing boundaries lately, testing the limits of the treaty, seeing how much they could intimidate other species before someone pushed back. Spoiler alert, no one ever did. Until that day, the Krathka's attention fixed on the human crew's table. Captain Tanaka was reviewing a datapad. Dmitry was doing maintenance on what looked like a slug thrower, an actual chemical propellant weapon. How quaint. Rosa was sketching something that was probably either brilliant or catastrophic. Ayana was eating some kind of earth food that smelled aggressively of spices, and Jinsu was trying to balance a fork on his nose, because apparently humans never entirely grow up. Throatrender approached their table with the confident swagger of a being that had never been told no and survived to hear it again. His mandibles clicked in what passed for Krathka laughter. "Humans," he said in Galactic Common, his translator rendering it with appropriate contempt. "I've heard your species claims to be brave, courageous even." Captain Tanaka looked up from her datapad with an expression of mild annoyance, like someone had interrupted her while she was counting something important. "We're just here for supplies," she said calmly. "Not looking for trouble." "Trouble," Throatrender repeated, and his companions, Bone Splitter and Flesh Tear, because of course, clicked their mandibles in amusement. "You misunderstand, Soft Skin. I'm not offering trouble. I'm offering a lesson in your place within the galactic hierarchy." The entire station went quiet. This was it, the moment when someone would back down, apologize, maybe even flee. That's how these encounters always went. The Krathka postured, someone submitted, and the universe continued its indifferent rotation. But Dimitri didn't look up from his weapon maintenance. Rosa kept sketching. Jinsu successfully balanced the fork on his nose and grinned at Ayana, who slow clapped sarcastically. And Captain Tanaka. She sighed. Like this was a tedious interruption to her afternoon, not a potential massacre. "Look," Tanaka said, "I appreciate the whole intimidation routine. Really, it's very impressive. The clicking, the looming, the threats failed as philosophy. But we've got a schedule to keep, and I'm going to need you to take your superiority complex elsewhere. I swear on my ancestors' bioluminescent graves, I've never seen a Krathka's mandibles freeze mid-click before." Throatrender seemed genuinely confused, like someone had just explained to him that gravity was actually optional and he'd been using it out of habit. "Do you understand what I am?" he asked, his voice dropping to a register that would make most beings' survival instincts scream. "A large insect with boundary issues?" Rosa offered without looking up from her sketch. Bone Splitter took a threatening step forward. Dimitri finally glanced up from his weapon, which I now realized was fully assembled and loaded, and made eye contact with the Krathka. It wasn't a look of fear or even defiance, it was the look of someone doing complex mathematics in their head and arriving at an answer they found mildly disappointing but entirely manageable. "My friend," Dimitri said in a voice like grinding tectonic plates, "I would reconsider." The tension in that moment could have powered a small star. I watched from my perch, my skin cycling through colors I didn't even know I could produce. Mostly variations on terrified purple and oh no orange. Every instinct I had screamed that violence was seconds away, that I was about to witness the first species stupid enough to challenge the Krathka and pay the inevitable price. But then something extraordinary happened. Throatrender looked at Dimitri, really looked at him. And in those multifaceted eyes, I saw something I'd never witnessed before in a Krathka calculation. Not the calculation of how to kill, but whether killing was worth the cost. His gaze swept across the human crew again, lingering on details I'd missed. The casual way Captain Tanaka's hand rested near her sidearm, the precision of Dimitri's weapon assembly, the fact that Rosa's sketch was actually a schematic for the station's power grid, with what looked like optimal overload points marked in red, the medical kit at Ayana's feet that definitely contained more than just bandages, and Jinsu's sweet fork balancing. Jinsu, whose eyes tracked every movement in the room with the focus of a surveillance system. These weren't soft-skinned novelties. These were predators pretending to be harmless, and they were very, very good at pretending. Throatrender's mandibles clicked once, twice. A sound I later learned meant reassessing threat parameters. Then, in a moment that I'll remember until my bioluminescence finally dims for good, he stepped back. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I was mistaken about your schedule's importance." Captain Tanaka smiled. A small, dangerous expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Mistakes happen. No harm done." The Krathka trio retreated, not in panic or haste, but with the careful dignity of apex predators who just realized the food chain had more complexity than they'd previously understood. As they left, I heard Bone Splitter mutter in their native tongue, which my translator only partially caught, something that roughly meant deathworlders and not worth it. The station exhaled collectively. Conversations resumed at half volume. The Krovan mercenaries downed their drinks in single gulps and started talking very loudly about other things. I unclenched muscles I didn't know I had, and the human crew, they went back to their business like nothing had happened. Dimitri resumed cleaning his weapon. Rosa continued her definitely not ominous sketching. Jinsu tried to balance the fork on his nose again, and failed this time, prompting Ayana to laugh. A sound like bells mixed with threat assessment. I should have left it alone. I should have stayed in my corner and minded my own business. But curiosity, that wonderful, terrible trait that's gotten my species into trouble since we first developed sentience, pulled me toward their table. "Excuse me," I said, my skin flickering between polite yellow and confused green. "But what just happened?" Captain Tanaka looked up and smiled. "Genuinely, this time. We avoided a fight. Seems like a good outcome. But the Krathka," I stammered. They're the Krathka. They don't back down. They don't retreat. They do, when the math doesn't work out," Dmitri interrupted, his accent thick but his words precise. "Risk versus reward. Basic cost-benefit analysis." "But you're humans," I said, and I could hear the confusion in my own voice. I mean, no offense, but your species is known for art and coffee, and asking philosophical questions, not for making Krathka back down." Jinsu laughed at that. A bright, genuine sound that seemed completely at odds with the person who'd been tracking combat vectors 30 seconds earlier. "Oh, we do all that stuff too," he said. "We're multifaceted like that." Rosa finally looked up from her schematic, and I noticed her eyes were warm brown with flecks of gold. "You want to know the secret?" she asked, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Earth, our homeworld. It's what we call a death world. Gravity 1.5 times what most species consider comfortable. Weather patterns that can shift from calm to catastrophic in minutes. Tectonic activity that reshapes continents. And an ecosystem where literally everything is trying to eat everything else, while simultaneously trying not to be eaten. Humans evolved," Ayana added, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd explained this before, in an environment where cooperation wasn't just beneficial, it was mandatory for survival. "We hunted animals bigger and stronger than us by working together, by being smarter and more persistent. We call it persistence hunting. We'd chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion while we just kept going. Plus," Dmitri said with a grin that showed too many teeth, "our planet tried to kill us in so many creative ways that we developed this unfortunate habit of solving problems instead of accepting them. Dangerous predator. We made weapons. Harsh climate. We made shelter, clothing, agriculture. Disease. We invented medicine by trial and error, and a lot of error. I felt my bioluminescence shifting to a color I'd never produced before, something between awestruck silver and existential crisis purple. So when Throatrender threatened you, he was expecting prey behavior," Captain Tanaka said, her fingers steepled in front of her. "Submission, fear, retreat. What he got was 5 predators evaluating whether he was worth the effort to put down. And he wasn't," Rosa added cheerfully, returning to her sketch. "Way too much paperwork. The Galactic Council gets really tedious about Krathka casualties." I must have looked shocked. Well, as shocked as a Selkathi can look, because Ayana reached over and patted my appendage gently. "We're not violent by preference, Vix," she said, somehow knowing my name without me offering it. "We just understand that sometimes the best way to avoid violence is to make the cost of initiating it seem very, very high." Over the next few hours, while the crew finished their resupply and repairs, I learned more about humanity than I'd absorbed in all my previous encounters combined. They bought me drinks, shared stories from Earth, and gradually I understood these beings had climbed from the bottom of their planet's food chain to the top, not through size or strength or natural weapons, but through stubbornness, creativity, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Dmitri told me about ancient human hunters who'd killed mammoths, creatures 10 times their size, using nothing but pointed sticks, cooperation, and audacity. Rosa explained how human engineering often involved spectacular failures, followed by incremental improvements, turning disasters into learning opportunities. Jinsu described human pilots who'd flown experimental aircraft that had no business staying airborne, pushing boundaries just to see what would happen. Ayana shared stories of human medicine, how they'd conquered diseases that had decimated populations through sheer determination and systematic experimentation. And Captain Tanaka, nursing something called whiskey that smelled like industrial solvent, told me the story I'll never forget, about a human explorer named Shackleton, who'd led his crew across Antarctic ice after their ship was crushed, keeping all 27 people alive through leadership, rationing, and an unwillingness to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed like the only logical outcome. "We're not fearless," she said quietly. "We're terrified most of the time. But we learned a long time ago that fear is just information, data to process and act on, not a command to obey." As they prepared to depart, word had spread through the station. I noticed something remarkable. Other species were watching the human crew differently now. The Krovan mercenaries nodded respectfully as they passed. The Thelonian refugees approached Captain Tanaka to thank her for what they didn't specify. But I understood. She'd done something no one else had, reminded the galaxy that hierarchy wasn't fixed, that apex predators could be challenged, that because we've always done it this way wasn't a law of physics. But the most extraordinary moment came as the human crew was boarding their ship. Throat Render reappeared, without his companions this time, which in Krathka body language meant something significant. He approached Captain Tanaka directly, his massive form towering over her. "Human Captain," he said, his mandibles moving in a pattern I'd never seen before, something like respect. "I have a question." Tanaka looked up at him without flinching. "Ask." "Your species," he began, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his clicking voice. "You came from a world that tried to kill you, yes? Where survival was not guaranteed." "That's right, and yet you survived, thrived, reached the stars despite having no natural weapons, no armored hide, no venom or claws." His multifaceted eyes studied her intently. "How?" Captain Tanaka smiled, not the dangerous smile from earlier, but something softer, almost sad. "We had each other," she said simply. "And we had spite. Lots and lots of spite. Every time the universe told us we couldn't do something, we took it as a personal challenge." Throat Render's mandibles clicked rapidly. Krathka laughter, I'd learned. "Spite," he repeated. "We do not have a word for this in our language." "You should get one," Rosa called from the ship's ramp. "It's extremely useful." The Krathka warrior stood there for a long moment, processing this information with whatever passed for contemplation in his species. Then he did something I'd never witnessed in 3 cycles of trade liaison work. He lowered his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, almost a bow. "Your species is young," he said. "But perhaps we have been evaluating strength incorrectly." After the humans departed, the station buzzed with conversation. I heard at least 15 different species recounting the confrontation, each version getting slightly more embellished. By the next cycle, it would be a legend. By the next rotation, it would be mythology. But I'd been there. I'd seen it with all 4 of my eyes, and I knew the truth was somehow more impressive than any story could capture. The thing is, it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following cycles, reports started filtering through trade networks. Stories of human ships negotiating with pirates, not through surrender, but through creative problem-solving. Human colonies on hostile worlds not just surviving but thriving. Human mediators, resolving conflicts that had seemed intractable by asking questions no one else thought to ask. 6 months later, I was in a conference room on Galactic Council Station Prime, a place I never thought I'd see because someone had recommended me as an expert on human behavior. Me, a mid-level trade liaison, who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The council was debating whether to grant humanity full member status, or keep them in probationary classification. The Krathka delegate stood to speak, and I recognized him immediately. Throat Render, now apparently representing his entire species in galactic politics. "I have encountered many species in my cycles," he said, his translator rendering his clicks into somber tones. "I have fought the Vorash, negotiated with the Centauri, and hunted across 17 systems. I believed I understood strength, that it came from physical prowess, from the ability to dominate through force." He paused, his mandibles moving in that pattern I now recognized as thoughtful consideration. The humans taught me that I was wrong. Strength is not the absence of weakness, it is the refusal to let weakness define you. Their world tried to kill them in ways my species cannot imagine, and they responded not with acceptance, but with innovation. They looked at impossible odds and said not good enough, then made the impossible reality through cooperation, creativity, and what they call spite. His multifaceted eyes swept across the council chamber. I vote to grant humanity full member status, not because they are weak and need our protection, but because they are strong in ways we have not yet learned to measure. They will challenge us, frustrate us, and probably make us uncomfortable. But perhaps that is exactly what the galaxy needs. The motion passed unanimously. I saw Captain Tanaka and her crew again about a year after our first meeting. They'd been hired to transport a Galactic Council delegation through a disputed sector. Apparently, their reputation for not backing down from apex predators had preceded them. When Tanaka saw me in the delegation, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Vix," she said, and I confess my bioluminescence went a bit pink with pleasure at being remembered. "How've you been?" "Confused mostly," I admitted. "Your species has turned galactic politics into chaos. Half the council is terrified of you, the other half wants to hire you for everything, and no one can quite agree on whether you're brilliant or insane." Dmitri, standing behind Tanaka, grinned broadly. "Why not both?" During that trip, I asked the question that had been bothering me since our first encounter. We were in the observation deck, watching hyperspace blur past in colors that shouldn't exist, and I finally worked up the courage. "Captain," I said, "that day on Tarthos-9, were you actually prepared to fight the Krathka? Or was it all calculated bluffing?" She was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee, which still smelled like industrial solvent, before answering, "Honestly, Vix, a bit of both. We assessed the situation, ran the numbers, and figured the odds of de-escalation through confidence were better than the odds of survival through submission. Throat Render was testing boundaries. We just tested back harder. But if you'd called your bluff, then we'd have adapted," she said simply. "Made a new plan. Humans are really good at making new plans when the old ones explode. Sometimes literally." Rosa, working on some incomprehensible piece of equipment nearby, laughed without looking up. "We have a saying on Earth, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. We just happen to be excellent at making new plans mid-punch." The galaxy's understanding of humanity has evolved significantly since that day on Tarthos-9. We've learned that these soft-skinned, seemingly fragile beings from a backwater world possess something more dangerous than claws or venom or armored hides. They possess adaptability, creativity, and an absolute unwillingness to accept that this is how things have always been means this is how things must always be. The Krathka still hunt across their 17 systems, but they do it with more caution now. Other species that relied on intimidation have learned that humanity doesn't respond to threats the way evolution programmed them to expect. And I've built an entire career on understanding human behavior, which mostly involves accepting that they'll surprise you right when you think you've figured them out. Last week, I received a message from Captain Tanaka. Her crew had discovered an ancient alien artifact that everyone said was impossible to access without destroying. Guess what they did? They accessed it without destroying it, naturally, using a combination of Rosa's engineering, Dimitri's stubborn refusal to accept impossibility, Jinso's precise calculations, Ayana's medical knowledge. Apparently the artifact had biological components, and Tanaka's leadership holding it all together. The message ended with a question. "Want to join us for the next job? Could use someone who actually understands what we're doing, even if we don't always understand it ourselves." My bioluminescence cycled through every color in the spectrum: excitement, terror, curiosity, that particular shade of why not that I'd learned from humans. I sent back one word: absolutely. Because here's what I've learned about humanity. What the whole galaxy is slowly, reluctantly, sometimes painfully learning: the most dangerous predator isn't the one with the biggest teeth or the strongest armor or the deadliest venom. The most dangerous predator is the one that looks at an impossible situation, laughs, and says, Watch this. And when that predator also knows how to cooperate, create, adapt, and refuses to accept that anything is truly audible, well, that's when the entire galaxy's apex predators start backing away. Not out of fear exactly, though there's some of that, but out of respect, and maybe, just maybe, out of curiosity about what these ridiculous, stubborn, spite-fueled deathworlders will do next.